From Ahern Field House on the Kansas State University campus, the K-State Radio Network presents an address by the Honorable George Romney, Governor of the state of Michigan, announced candidate for the Republican presidential nomination. Governor Romney's topic this morning will be the challenge of international development. He is this year's second speaker in the distinguished series of Landon Lectures on public issues here at Kansas State University. This morning's address is receiving a great deal of national attention. It's the first major address by Governor Romney since he announced his candidacy for the presidential nomination. It's the only major address he'll be making in this country until after the first of the year. He'll be leaving this afternoon for nearly a 4-week tour of Europe and Southeast Asia. Governor Romney arrived in Manhattan this morning. He attended a breakfast earlier for Landon Lecture patrons and other dignitaries, all of whom are now seated here in Ahern Field House. Now for the formal introductions, we switch to the podium and Kansas State University President Dr. James A. McCain.
It's my pleasure to welcome to this convocation not only you who are here in the field house, but persons in a large television audience who will view these proceedings and hear this lecture this morning live, and many thousands of persons, not only in Kansas but in neighboring states, who are a part of our audience through listening to the broadcast of this lecture on the radio. I would remind you once again that we are gathered here this morning at the fourth of the lectures in the Alfred M. Landon Lecture Series on public issues, and that we have as a guest of honor the Honorable Alfred M. Landon, whom you have already recognized so enthusiastically, one of the great men of our times, whom it's our privilege to count as an adopted son of Kansas State University and to recognize through these programs. To introduce our speaker this morning, it's my pleasure to introduce to you the first citizen of our state, the Honorable Robert Docking, Governor of the state of Kansas, a warm and vigorous supporter of higher education, a man who has honored us often with his presence on this campus in a most generous and gracious fashion. I present to you the governor of our state who will introduce our speaker, Governor Robert Docking.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, President McCain, for that most generous introduction. Distinguished guests, students, faculty, and friends. It is an honor for me to be invited again to the Kansas State University campus to participate in the Landon Lecture Series. Several weeks ago, it was my pleasure to accept the university's invitation to introduce Governor Ronald Reagan of California to Kansas State students as a part of this series. If I have an opportunity to introduce other similarly distinguished Republicans during the next few months, I may feel qualified to make introductions at the Republican National Convention next summer. Frankly, I doubt that I will have this opportunity. In a few days, Governor Romney will begin a tour of Europe. Following his European tour, he will begin weeks of campaigning in the United States for the Republican presidential nomination. In Europe, Governor Romney, I wish you well. I know you understand why I cannot offer you exactly the same encouragement here in the United States. Today, we have a candidate for the Republican presidential nomination in 1968, sharing the platform with the Republican presidential nominee of 31 years ago. Your presence today, Governor Romney, contributes to the growing reputation, the mounting respect given to the Landon Lecture Series. The series was initiated to honor a celebrated Kansan, a respected American, Alfred Landon. I know of no man who deserves such an honor more than Governor Landon, a man who for decades has stood as a champion for free thought and free speech. It is with these very principles in mind that these thousands of students have gathered not only to see and to hear a major political figure in our nation today, not only to see what a presidential candidate looks like, sounds like, but because they are interested, because they are concerned. They have come today because they want to be informed of the complexities of their surroundings so that they may make themselves heard in a variety of professions and vocations, and also in the democratic processes of government. In Kansas, we are very proud of our young citizens. We are proud that they are here today. The students gathered here are seeking answers to questions that face our country today, and they will want answers of substance, articulated alternatives, before they will see the face of our government change. They will not settle for platitudes or generalities or vague discussions of right and wrong. They ask which way our country moves, not only today and next year, not only for a decade, but for their lifetimes and the lifetimes of their children. They deserve this consideration from you and me. They deserve our best attempts to answer their questions. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor to introduce the governor of the state of Michigan and candidate for the 1968 Republican presidential nomination, George Romney.
Thank you very much, Governor Bob Docking, for your gracious introduction and your gracious hospitality since I arrived in this great state of Kansas. I am pleased also that the Lieutenant Governor, Governor Crutcher, is present. And of course, I am highly honored to participate in this Landon Lecture series. When President McCain announced establishment of the Landon Lecture series, he said it was designed to fill a need for public information and objective discussion of public issues by outstanding figures in both political parties. And it's certainly fitting that such an objective should be established in honor of Governor Landon. Governor Landon has frequently explained that he didn't seek almost certain election to the United States Senate because he wanted the freedom to speak out on issues whenever he had something to say, and he wanted to refrain from speaking when he had nothing to contribute. Well, Governor Landon has kept well informed about all levels of politics and has not hesitated to speak out whenever he felt there was a need. And I must admit that I'm very much interested in his technique. In the first Landon Lecture a year ago, he said President Johnson was not leveling with the people. Well, his remarks were reported to the public without causing a particular furor. And more recently, when asked about the situation in South Vietnam, he replied, "Hogwash." And the public again took note of his basic wisdom. And I must say I admire his choice of words. Now, one of the things that makes Governor Landon unusually refreshing is that he's living with his eyes faced forward, not backward. And this is very unusual for anyone, but particularly for those with more past than future. As Boss Kettering, the great research genius of General Motors, used to say, people should be built with rear view mirrors so they would stop going through life with their eyes on the past and thus backing into the future. Now, most of you present have more future than past. But one thing we all have in common is that we will spend the rest of our lives in the future. And I want to tell you about the future, your future, and one of the most important things that will shape it for your generation of Americans. I believe with Lincoln that freedom and its benefits are intended for all men everywhere for all future time. It's America's mission on this earth to shape our principles with all men everywhere, to share our principles, and to encourage freedom for all mankind. Now, our country today is certainly the most favored nation on earth. But our strength comes from our foundations of religious, moral, and political principle, foundations which have made material success possible and almost inevitable. But we must use our wealth and our means to help others. We must never limit our aid to others to guns and butter or even wheat. American ideals are more important, and sharing our ideals and our principles and the things that really made this country is essential to the fulfillment of our destiny and our purpose. Now, one of the greatest challenges facing us today is the huge difference in living standards between the rich industrialized northern nations and the poor, underdeveloped southern peoples. The development gap, as it is called, is widening. The have nations have failed to adequately commit their vision, their will, and their resources to the task. And the have-not nations are losing ground. Now, unfortunately, most Americans perceive neither the proportions of this problem nor the dangers it presents to our own interests and our own future. What we take for granted in our own society preempts our consciousness of human deprivation elsewhere. Our natural confidence about the future obscures awareness of how fragile the future is under the best of circumstances. And in this sense, we are isolating and alienating ourselves from the rest of the world as it really is. In my talk today, I first want to take a quick look at the development problem in terms of its size and national interest, and in terms of what needs to be done about it. And then I'll discuss U.S. aid, trade, and private resource policies as they relate to development and suggest certain courses of action. Now, what are the dimensions of the development challenge? The gross national product of the United States is $3,240 per person, and of course we have 200 million people. Mainland China's national product is $85 per person, and they have over 2 billion people. Japan and Indonesia are roughly the same population, but Japan has 9 times better productivity. Canada has 1/4 the population, but almost 10 times the per person productivity of Brazil. By the end of this century, on the present basis, the per capita income of Americans will have risen by 30 times as much as the increase in most underdeveloped countries. 30 times. Underdevelopment is a single word that sums up illiteracy, poverty, hunger, disease, human misery. It breeds violence and anarchy. It represents a vacuum. Underdevelopment is a greater danger than communist aggression. The communists exploit underdevelopment to spread their power and influence. And the communists have been preparing for years to do this, importantly by two things. Number one, they have carefully spread the idea among the underdeveloped peoples that the have nations are prosperous because they have exploited the have-not nations. And then another idea that they've spread generally is that private investment in the have-not nations is simply an indirect means of the have nations establishing control over the have-not nations and thus robbing them of their independence, and that they should be as aware and concerned about private investment in these countries as they are about political imperialism. Now, we must successfully attack the basic economic development problems now or face more Vietnams later. There are a number of incipient Vietnams around the world right now. And the dollar cost of investment for peace is nowhere near the dollar cost for war. If we remain an affluent island surrounded by a sea of poverty, our whole way of life will be threatened. If the lot of the deprived peoples does not improve, and if their hopes for a better life wither, widespread violence directly affecting life in the United States will be increased. If we, and I include our industrialized colleagues on the continent of Europe and the few countries in Asia, become the exclusive rich minority, we will be dangerously vulnerable to the massive poor majority. Now, this huge underdeveloped majority would have practically nothing to lose in an international struggle. These views are not theory on my part. These views are based on experiences of my life. I was born in Old Mexico. My people went down there as impoverished as the people they moved among. By using the methods that were used to settle the desert west, dams, canals, irrigation, they became an island of prosperity in the midst of abject poverty. They, along with a few other foreigners. And the first communist national war of liberation in history resulted in my being driven from Mexico. General Salazar, who was a communist general with Pancho Villa then as an aide, played on the envy of the impoverished people in northern Mexico to the point where they decided to drive out these few rich people and take over what they had built up. And thus I have seen what envy can do when exploited by those who want to destroy us. So this is not theory with me, this is experience. Development is necessary for peace, and peace is necessary for development. Turmoil defeats progress. Violence perpetuates human misery by discouraging the systematic organization of resources needed to raise living standards. But fear of instability should not be an excuse to maintain the status quo, nor can or should the revolution of rising expectations be suppressed because of the danger of disorder. It is critical that change occur, radical change in many places, and quickly. But supporting change does not mean fomenting violence. We must use our leadership and our influence to guide change into constructive rather than destructive channels. The national self-interest of America is directly, irrevocably involved in international development. The continued growth of free economies depends on the expansion of international trade and markets. From an investment and enterprise standpoint, development of the underdeveloped can be more profitable than investing in activities in areas already developed. Whenever you take something and develop it, you get a bigger return than if you just take over something that's pretty well developed. And the result is that there's opportunity greater than ever before in this world for your generation. Now, what can be done about underdevelopment? Well, at present, our national response is characterized by lower levels of foreign economic assistance, heightened threats of protectionism, and insignificant private enterprise involvement in the business of development. There is a general failure of vision, will, and leadership. The flow of long-term capital from the haves to the have-nots has remained about the same since 1961, despite a rise in the national income of the richer nations. There's no question but that the industrialized nations can afford to meet the current growth needs of the developing nations without hurting themselves. In fact, they would very much benefit from such investment. In the case of the United States, our gross national product for 200 million people has increased by more than $100 billion since 1960, as compared with less than $35 billion for the more than 2 billion people in the less developed world. Now, that's a ratio of 3.5 to 100. We are slipping. The gap is growing. The danger is increasing. We must find a way to avert this potential disaster for the world. But this is no Marshall Plan exercise to rebuild highly sophisticated industrial economies. The underdeveloped nations are starting from scratch. They face economic handicaps not faced by the now developed nations during their development. Most have-not nations have no political tradition and little sense of nationhood. They have little base to build on and no institutional infrastructure and no large body of educated or trained manpower. Now, we must not be arbitrary or impatient in our approach, nor can we be exclusive or paternalistic. Progress-sharing partnerships between the affluent industrial countries and the underdeveloped areas should be a paramount objective of American foreign policy. And this demands changes in our aid, trade, and private resource policies. Private enterprise embodies the very genius of the American economy and contains the contagious germ of freedom. And the underdeveloped world must be exposed to the dynamic private enterprise systems of the Northern Hemisphere and a substantial inflow of private investment. Now, even under the most optimistic predictions of trade reform and private resource inflow, it is unlikely that the underdeveloped nations can achieve their development goals without more foreign aid. The foreign aid program has few friends. It has no political constituency in the United States. It has made some bad errors. It has been wasteful. And many nations have received our aid, and they appear ungrateful. And worse still, some of them even oppose us on international issues. Now, it's easy to criticize our foreign aid program, but it is difficult to argue that government aid is not needed in meeting this urgent problem. I believe that the private sector must supply the bulk of the resources needed to assist the underdeveloped nations in their growth. But I also believe that our foreign aid levels have been cut below the amounts required for the necessary input of public funds in meeting this development challenge. As a percentage of our gross national product, American foreign aid has plummeted to a level about one-half that maintained during the last years of the Eisenhower administration. The development loans requested for the current fiscal year amounted to only 78% of the $975 million actually appropriated in 1963. The current administration has shown little real leadership in international development, and the foreign aid program shows it. In 1957, John Foster Dulles testified for the establishment of the Development Loan Fund, stressing that it would be devoted to, quote, the capital needed to create the economic environment in which private initiative can come into play, end quote. Now, public monies help to improve the climate and build the institutions and train the technicians needed to permit private enterprise to function effectively in this development program. What does a private investor look for? He looks for a stable government. He looks for one committed to the private enterprise approach, for an equitable tax structure, for a reasonable system of export controls, for an educational system that can produce skilled manpower, for an adequate and reasonably cheap power supply, for a reliable transportation system, and for wider markets or the potential of wider markets. The aid program, directly and indirectly, can help provide these assets. And of course, technical assistance in the foreign aid program, in which your university has been very active, is essential for development. Capital alone can't do the job if you don't have trained men to manage your projects. Our foreign aid program needs a lot of reform. There are many problems and limitations in government-to-government assistance. And I believe that we must put more stress on trade and private investment than in aid. But we need aid. One is not a substitute for another, and all are closely interrelated. Now, the importance of trade policies and patterns to the development opportunity has been tragically underrated. The continued support of international trade and the liberalization of existing trade restrictions must be pursued with a dedication and a vigor which have been sadly lacking. The Kennedy round of tariff negotiations achieved agreements affecting $40 billion in world trade. We gave tariff cuts on $7.5 to $8 billion of our industrial and agricultural imports and obtained tariff reductions on about the same amount of our exports. But the Kennedy round didn't really address the development challenge. And the administration's position in the trade field as it pertains more directly to the poorer nations is uncertain and uncommitted. It is vital for the underdeveloped nations to trade more if they are to develop. And it is vital for the international community to create a trade environment that would foster rather than frustrate the growth of developing nations. Now, this is the basic aim of the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, which meets again in February in New Delhi, India. UNCTAD, as it is called, recommended in 1963 that the industrial countries, in order to create markets for their manufactured exports and to bring about the gradual reduction of the obstacles hindering the entry of these exports to the industrial countries, that the exports of the underdeveloped countries be given preferential treatment, and allowing, as a result of this, the poor nations to export more would enable them to import more, thus adjusting their trade balance and allowing them to get investment capital and capital equipment, which they, of course, desperately need. Now, at the 1963 UNCTAD session, the U.S. opposed this proposal of preference. I hope our delegation to the next UNCTAD meeting will carry instructions allowing it to strongly support the general preference for the poorer nations in concert with a similar position by other industrialized nations. Extension of preferences is indispensable in integrating the underdeveloped countries with the free economies of the North. Now, recently, a huge protectionist activity in Congress has gotten underway, and this is a retrogression to economic nationalism. And this development has caused fears throughout the international economic world. And this new deadly serious protectionist drive could affect 80% of our dutiable exports. Dutiable imports. Now, the answer will be, if we permit this protectionist drive to express itself, will be retaliation by the other nations of the world. According to the system of international trade rules that we have, for every restriction we impose on imports, an equivalent restriction on our exports abroad can be imposed by other countries. If we want to sell, we have to buy. And when we try to insulate some sector of our industry from international competition, some part of the United States economy pays for it. In addition, the quotas recommended by these protectionists would result in higher prices for U.S. consumers and increased governmental controls. Now, the real problem that this protectionism drive represents is the need to correct the inflationary forces that have been loosed in this country. And these inflationary forces involve more than deficit spending. They involve our economic policies that have got to be modernized. And these forces are making us non-competitive in world markets. There is no assurance that the United States of America is going to continue to lead in its productivity and its technology. Japan is already outstripping us in basic industries. We're asleep and indifferent to what these loose policies are doing to us at home as well as abroad. Now, we need to fill the crucial gaps in our national trade policy. Legislation is needed to restore the U.S. government's unused negotiating authority, which ran out on June 30th. We don't have any authority to make any tariff adjustments. And new legislation must also liberalize the criteria for the Adjustment Act under the 1932 Expansion Act, which proved in practice to be too tight and rigid for companies or industries in trouble, so tight that adjustments couldn't be made that could have prevented this protectionist surge from getting underway. The administration is tardy and unresolved in its trade policy, and accordingly has courted confusion and reaction. However, the greatest lack in the development effort today is the astounding absence of substantial participation by the private portion of our economy. Without the tremendous capital resources, the unparalleled know-how, and the aggressive spirit of private enterprise, there is no possibility by which the development gap can be effectively narrowed. The present low rate of American investment represents a crippling failure of our own response to the development challenge. The private flow has been decreasing, both in terms of gross national product and overall investment. Given the great need of the poor nations for capital, the limitations on the amount and the efficacy of public funds, and the free enterprise traditions of this country, government aid should be a supplement to private involvement. But at the present time, the commitment of government funds is over 4 times the rate of private commitment. It should be the opposite. Now, what can be done about this private enterprise gap? Well, ways must be found to diminish the risk of loss and to enhance the prospect of profit for the investor in the underdeveloped areas. And governments must cooperate to improve the private enterprise climate in the underdeveloped countries, and that means we need leadership that not only understands private enterprise in this country, but also has faith in it, and has faith that by unleashing the talents of individuals and their enterprises, undeveloped nations will make greater progress than under centralized government control. That's how we developed, and that's how other nations can do it most rapidly. We've lost that faith. We've got to get it back. Private business must perceive its own interests in broader and larger terms. The ingenuity of private enterprise must be devoted to applying the principles of progress sharing and partnership in relationship with foreign peoples to put an end to the fears of international economic imperialism and exploitation. Private investment abroad must be viewed not just as a migration of capital, but a transfer of skills, know-how, and techniques. And universities and foundations and other private organizations in the developing countries need to be encouraged, and internationally as well. And there can be a greater degree of cooperation between the private organizations themselves. Now, there's some encouraging things developing. There are recommendations being made by private organizations and actions being taken that are significant and innovative. The report of the Advisory Committee on Private Enterprise and Foreign Aid, submitted in 1965, contains some helpful suggestions. This committee recommended amendments to the tax law so that losses suffered by American-owned subsidiaries in developing countries could be offset against profits earned elsewhere. It suggested that development be given priority over immediate balance of payment considerations, and that special attention be given to the role of agriculture in the less developed countries. U.S. firms have shown increasing interest in basic economic development projects, in joint venture arrangements which foster a partnership relationship, and in local management and the transfer of ownership and control to native majority ownership. Obstacle-free international trade bridges on a company-to-company or an industry-to-industry basis have been initiated. Examples are in the agricultural implement business and the automotive industry between the United States and Canada. And international investment companies have been created that have been very useful. These ideas and activities are heartening, but they must be vastly expanded and multiplied. And I would recommend in the executive branch reforms in the aid program and liberalization of southern trade, preferential treatment, as I have indicated, and greater diplomatic efforts to create better climates for private investment and more cooperation of industrialized nations in development effort. Increased tax incentives for foreign investment in underdeveloped areas. Beefing up of the existing investment guarantee programs. The enlargement at home and at posts abroad of the excellent activities of the AIDS Office of Private Resources. And stronger cross-sectional governmental authority and action on policies affecting the less developed areas to avoid some of the problems with the politics-ridden and bureaucratically mired war on hunger program, for example. In Congress, I would recommend the establishment of a joint congressional committee on private initiative in international development. Such an agency could enable Congress to play a stronger and less parochial role in supporting the involvement of private enterprise in meeting the worldwide challenge, and would lend a lot more prestige to that aspect of the effort. In the private sector itself, I would recommend the establishment of an international development coalition made up of representatives of business, finance, unions, industry, who would make continuing studies and recommendations to private organizations on the one hand and to the federal government on the other concerning the best methods of private international investment and enterprise and the best policies to facilitate such involvement. And I would recommend to you, as individuals who are going to be affected more than most Americans by what we do in this area, that you walk into your exciting future face forward, and don't be like bugs in a Persian rug. You know, a bug can live in a Persian rug all its life and never get up high enough above the fibers to see the pattern in the rug. Now, sometimes people come along who can get a bird's eye view of things instead of a worm's eye view of things. I heard such a man recently. He'd gone around the world 40 times. He had talked to people all over the earth, in most countries. And he said there are 4 things that people want most all over the earth. One is peace. The second is food. The third is human dignity. And the fourth is representative government. Now, these are the things that Americans, above all people in the history of the world, are in the best position to help meet and supply. But whether we will do it or not is still very much in the balance. We're not headed very much in that direction, in my opinion. I think there's real question today whether we'll make as great a contribution to the uplifting of the peoples of the earth as they made in Greece or Rome or Britain. And yet we're in the position to make an infinitely greater contribution. And I congratulate you on being at a university where your president and those responsible have shaped a program that reflects the concerns that I voiced here today. I understand there are 500 students from foreign lands in your student body, a very high proportion. And I urge you to equip yourselves for the opportunity that exists for Americans around the earth to share first our principles and then our means and our methods. Thank you very much.
Governor Romney, we are grateful for this address,